The driveway curved like a practice gesture, the kind a house makes when it expects visitors and wants to guide them gently into behaving. Gravel whispered under the tires, then went quiet as the car eased onto stone, and the estate rose ahead with its lights already set to an elegant warmth. The building had been there longer than most loyalties in the city. It had watched money change hands, watched names get softened for newspapers and hardened for fear. Tonight it watched him return, not as a son who needed permission, but as a man whose presence rearranged the air. He stepped out with a stillness that looked like calm until you noticed how it controlled the space around him. The guards at the gate did not salute with ceremony. They acknowledged him with the practical efficiency of people who had learned what was acceptable and what was dangerous. Inside the car, the smell of leather and cold metal lingered like a second skin. Outside, the garden smelled of wet earth and trimmed hedges, the sort of cleanliness that always costs someone else's hands. He adjusted his cuff once, not out of vanity but out of habit, then began walking toward the front doors as if he had already decided how the night would end. The gathering was meant to look like tradition, like family. He knew better. These dinners were contracts in disguise, old alliances fed with wine and flattery until they felt like affection. Underneath, each guest measured him. They measured the reach of his power, the discipline of his temper, the steadiness of his rule. They did it with smiles and soft voices, because the ones who had survived long enough understood that open provocation was crude. Cruelty had evolved. It had learned manners. In the foyer, the house smelled of polished wood and lilies that had been cut before they could wilt. Staff moved with the quiet rhythm of people trained to be invisible. A silver tray passed near him with glasses that caught the chandelier light and turned it into thin, trembling stars. Somewhere deeper inside, laughter rose and fell in waves. Too loud to be spontaneous, too measured to be sincere. He followed the sound not because he wanted it, but because it was expected. His mother stood near the edge of the main salon, close enough to the circle of guests to be part of it, far enough to be kept in her place. She wore a dark dress that fit her with dignified restraint, the kind of elegance that didn't beg for admiration. A pearl necklace lay at her throat like a quiet claim. Her posture was composed, shoulders back, chin steady, but her hands betrayed her, fingers pressing lightly against each other, as if she were holding something together that could split. When she saw him, her face softened with relief she tried to hide behind a practiced smile. It was the smile of someone who had spent years learning how to survive rooms that wanted to make her small. He crossed to her and kissed her cheek, a gesture that could be tender or political depending on who watched. Tonight it was both. He felt the faint scent of her perfume, something familiar and modest, and beneath it the sharper trace of anxiety. Around them the guests shifted. Some turned toward him with eager warmth, others with restraint that suggested distance was a moral choice. Men in tailored suits and women draped in expensive fabric carried their status like armor. Their eyes flicked to his mother and back to him, like a silent conversation about what she represented. She was not merely his parent in their minds. She was evidence of origins, of legitimacy, of the parts of his life he could not rewrite with money. A man with gray at his temples approached first, his smile wide enough to be insulting. He offered his hand, then spoke to the boss with the exaggerated familiarity of someone who wanted to appear unafraid. Compliments were traded, followed by small talk about business that sounded harmless to anyone who didn't know the weight behind certain words. The man then turned to his mother and made a remark that landed softly, like a feather meant to hide the blade beneath. He praised her resilience, said it as if it were a quaint quality in someone who had no other options. He called her strong, the way people call the poor strong when they want to excuse their suffering. His mother nodded politely, lips pressed in a thin line of gratitude she did not owe. The boss watched, expression unreadable. He noticed how the man's wife didn't look at his mother directly, how her gaze skimmed over her as if she were furniture the house had always had. He noticed the slight pause before his mother was offered a drink, as if the staff needed permission from the guests' expectations. None of it was accidental. The insults were designed to be deniable. A maid stood near the doorway with a tray, young enough that her cheeks still held some softness despite the fatigue around her eyes. Her uniform was clean but worn at the seams. She moved carefully, not because she lacked confidence, but because the wrong movement in a room like this could cost her a week's pay or her dignity. She noticed more than she showed. Her eyes took in the way the guests angled their bodies, the way laughter surged when certain names were mentioned, the way silence formed like a trap after certain remarks. She had served many dinners, but tonight the cruelty was dressed in silk. The boss took a glass of water rather than wine, a choice that made some guests blink. Drunk men made mistakes. Tonight he wanted no mistakes from himself. He listened to conversation drift toward stories of charity galas and private schools, the kind of casual boasting that sounded like weather. When his mother spoke, she did so with measured warmth, but her voice was met with half attention. The guests smiled and then talked over her, redirecting the topic as if her contribution had been decorative. A woman with too bright lipstick leaned slightly toward another guest and spoke in a voice meant to be private but not truly hidden. The maid heard it. The boss heard it too because he had learned to catch the smallest shifts in a room. The comment was about how far people can come. Delivered with a laugh that suggested his mother's background was an amusing myth rather than a life lived. The woman's eyes flicked toward his mother's pearls as if evaluating whether they were real. His mother did not flinch. She kept her expression calm, but there was a moment when her gaze lowered to her own hands, as if checking whether they still belonged on the surface of this world. The boss felt the old anger rise, familiar and heavy. Violence would be easy. A word, a nod, a gesture. The entire room could be reduced to terror in seconds. But terror was a blunt tool, and tonight the test was subtler. They wanted him to prove he was uncontrolled. They wanted a spectacle that would justify their contempt and give them leverage in future negotiations. He chose restraint the way some men chose prayer. He tightened his grip on the glass until his knuckles paled, then loosened it again. He placed a hand lightly at his mother's back, not to steer her, but to remind her she was not alone. He spoke to the group with polite firmness, bringing the conversation back to neutral ground, responding to barbs with calm statements that refused to carry shame. His control unsettled them more than rage would have. It denied them the story they had come to collect. The maid moved among the guests, offering refills, clearing plates that were barely touched, watching patterns. She could feel the imbalance like a draft in a closed room. She recognized it because she lived in its shadow every day. Rich people did not always shout to humiliate. They simply decided who deserved full attention and who did not. Tonight, they had decided the boss's mother was safe to diminish, because they assumed he would either accept it or explode. As the first course was announced and guests drifted toward the dining room, the mother adjusted her necklace once, a small motion that was almost a tremor. The boss offered his arm and she took it. Their steps were matched, slow and steady, as if they were entering not a meal but a courtroom. The maid watched them pass, her tray balanced on one palm, her other hand tucked close to her apron. She did not know the details of their history, only the truth of what she had witnessed. Dignity being tested for entertainment. When the dining room doors opened, the chandelier light fell over everyone with the same generosity, but the room itself seemed to choose favorites. The boss guided his mother to her seat with deliberate care, making sure she was placed where she could not be overlooked. The guests settled in, still smiling, still measuring. The maid stepped back into her position along the wall, invisible again, but her thoughts remained sharp. She understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has seen cruelty up close, that the evening's discomfort was not a misunderstanding. It was a performance, and everyone had been assigned a role. Tonight, she decided, she would keep watching closely, not out of curiosity, but out of an instinct to recognize harm before it became normal. The dining room carried its own kind of authority. It did not need to announce itself. It simply existed with the confidence of inherited wealth. Walls dressed in dark wood, a long table that seemed to stretch on purpose, and crystal that broke the chandelier light into disciplined fragments. The scent of butter and rosemary rose from covered platters, warm and inviting. yet it couldn't soften the sharper undertone of perfume and old cigars that clung to the guests. As everyone settled into their places, chairs moved back with polite restraint, but the sound still felt like a collective decision being made. The boss guided his mother in with a steadiness that looked effortless to strangers and felt deliberate to anyone who knew him. He placed her where the room could not pretend she didn't exist, close enough to him that her presence was a fact and not a suggestion. Even that, he sensed, would be read as a statement. Around them, the guests arranged themselves with the quiet choreography of people who had spent their whole lives learning where they belonged and who should be kept at the edges. The seating was a map of hierarchy, and everyone pretended it was coincidence. The maid stood along the wall, hands folded near her apron, eyes lowered in the way she had been trained. But her attention stayed awake. From that angle she could see the way a smile tightened at the wrong moment, the way a glance lingered over jewelry, the way a plate was set down with just a touch less care when it was placed before someone deemed unimportant. She had learned that cruelty rarely arrived with shouting. It arrived like etiquette. It arrived with rules that only some people were allowed to break. A man at the far end of the table lifted his glass before the first course had even been served. His tone carried that practiced warmth that sounded like friendship until you listened closely. The room followed him easily, because the richest people always acted as if they were doing everyone a favor by speaking first. He proposed a toast to family, to heritage, to the women who keep the home strong. The words were harmless on their surface, and that was the point. As he spoke, his gaze touched the boss's mother for half a second longer than necessary, as if pinning the speech to her like a tag. Glasses rose in a neat wave, and the maid watched the mother's hand lift too, careful, graceful, her wrist steady despite the faint stiffness in her shoulders. The boss held his own glass of water, raising it at the same pace as the others, giving the toast nothing to latch onto. He could feel the trap being set. If he refused, they would say he disrespected tradition. If he accepted too warmly, they would claim he didn't notice the insult hidden inside. He let his face remain calm, his eyes steady, and allowed the moment to pass without granting it emotional fuel. The toast ended with soft laughter, and immediately the talk turned into a series of performances. Compliments came wrapped in velvet. A woman across from the mother leaned in, smiling as if she were offering intimacy, and praised her simplicity. The words spoken with a delicate emphasis that made it sound like a limitation rather than a virtue. Another guest remarked on how refreshing it was to see someone who still remembered where she came from, as if the past were a stain the mother had failed to scrub away. Each comment was followed by a polite nod from the mother, her expression composed, her mouth shaped into gratitude she did not feel. The boss noticed everything. He noticed the way people addressed him directly and then spoke about his mother as if she were part of the furniture that came with the estate. He noticed how questions were asked of her that weren't real questions, questions designed to place her in a smaller story. Where did she grow up? Asked with too much curiosity, as if they expected a poor neighborhood to entertain them. What did her parents do? Asked with a smile that assumed the answer would be something they could pity. They weren't gathering information. They were gathering permission to judge. His mother responded with practiced calm, answering lightly, never giving too much, never refusing outright. The steadiness in her voice was not confidence born of comfort. It was survival learned the hard way. The maid could see it more clearly than the guests did, because the maid had worn that same calm before supervisors, before rich women who treated her like air, before men who assumed a uniform meant a person had no boundaries. The mother's composure was not softness. It was armor made from years of being told she should feel grateful to be allowed into certain rooms. As plates arrived, the humiliation became more deliberate. A serving bowl paused at the mother's place just a beat too long, then was offered to someone else first, as if the natural order demanded she wait. A guest requested a particular dish be moved down the table, bypassing her hands entirely, forcing her to sit still and accept the role of spectator at her own meal. These were small movements, easily dismissed, but stacked together they formed a pattern that felt like a hand pressing down. The boss's jaw tightened once, then relaxed. He could have corrected it with a single look toward the staff, could have made the room adjust instantly out of fear. But fear would stain his mother's dignity with his violence, turning her protection into another kind of spectacle. He watched instead, calculating. He tracked who initiated the slights and who followed with laughter. He observed who avoided participating, who looked down at their plate when the insults landed. In his world, information was a weapon, and tonight he was collecting names, habits, alliances. He stayed composed not because he didn't care, but because he cared enough to choose timing. The maid moved silently with a pitcher, refilling glasses, and that closeness brought her into the orbit of whispered cruelty. She heard two women behind their napkins remark that the mother must be proud, said in a tone that suggested pride was something she had borrowed and should return. She heard a man murmur that it was impressive how someone with such beginnings had adapted, the word beginnings spoken like a warning label. The maid's fingers tightened around the pitcher handle until the metal pressed into her skin. She kept pouring with steady hands, because the job required steadiness even when your stomach turned. What struck her most was the entitlement. The guests acted as if the mother owed them a performance of humility, as if her presence threatened the story they told themselves about class and deserving. The maid began to understand the mother's specific vulnerability. It wasn't simply that she was being mocked. It was that her past was being treated as proof that she could never fully belong, no matter how fine the tablecloth, no matter how quiet her dignity. They were punishing her for having survived upward, for standing beside power without the right pedigree to justify it. The mother's eyes flicked once toward the maid's side of the room, not in distress, not calling for rescue, but in a brief moment of shared recognition. The maid felt it like a small hand reaching across class. It told her something important. The mother knew exactly what was happening, and she had been enduring it for a long time. The mother lowered her gaze again and continued eating, her fork moving with calm precision. The maid saw how much effort that calm required, how it drew from a deep well of discipline. By the time the first course was cleared, the dining room had settled into its cruel rhythm. The guests were comfortable, almost pleased with themselves, because they had managed to press their contempt into polite shapes. The boss remained quiet, but his silence did not feel like absence. It felt like containment. His mother sat upright, still dignified, even as the room tried to make her shrink. The maid, returning to her place along the wall, felt her awareness sharpen into something close to resolve. The evening had shown her that humiliation could be served as neatly as dinner, and that the most dangerous people were often the ones who never raised their voice. She breathed in slowly, steadied herself, and accepted that her role tonight was not only to serve, but to witness clearly. The second course arrived with a fragrance that tried to soften the room. Wine reduced into sweetness, meat cooked to tenderness, herbs warmed until they released their bitterness gently. For a moment, the table looked like what it was meant to resemble. Stability, prosperity, tradition. But the beauty of the service only made the cruelty beneath it feel more deliberate, as if the house itself had been instructed to provide a clean stage for something unclean. The guests had grown comfortable. Their laughter now came faster, not because they were having more fun, but because they had decided the evening was going their way. They had tested the boss's restraint and found him silent. They had tested his mother's dignity and found her composed. To people like them, composure was permission. It meant the target would not fight back in a way that cost them social comfort. The rules were theirs, and they expected everyone else to play along. His mother ate slowly, as if giving each bite time to settle her stomach. She didn't touch the wine. She kept her posture upright, shoulders back, napkin folded neatly across her lap. The pearls at her throat caught the chandelier light every time she moved, and the boss noticed how often the guests' eyes drifted there, measuring. It wasn't the jewelry they resented. It was what it symbolized, that the woman they had decided to diminish still carried herself like she deserved to be at the table. He sat beside her with his glass of water, his face still, his attention alive. He watched the way the oldest men spoke in calm, confident tones, and the way the younger ones echoed them with eager loyalty. He watched the women lean in toward each other, their mouths shaped into smiles while their eyes stayed sharp. He watched who served the insults openly and who let them pass without protest, because complicity had many faces. In his world, that kind of observation was not paranoia. It was survival disguised as patience. The maid moved in and out of the table's orbit, refilling glasses, collecting plates, making herself smaller when she passed behind chairs. Her uniform smelled faintly of soap and starch, but her hands carried the warmer scent of food, wine, and metal. She had learned how to be present without becoming visible, but tonight visibility pressed against her skin like an itch. She had heard enough whispers to understand the pattern, and the more she understood, the less she could pretend it was harmless. When the talk turned toward origins, the room didn't even attempt subtlety anymore. A man with a ring too large for his finger leaned back and spoke about old families, with the lazy pride of someone who inherited his confidence. He mentioned the estate's history, praised its purity, and then, as naturally as breathing, let the conversation slide toward how new money always arrived with new problems. His tone remained friendly, but his eyes lifted toward the boss's mother as if pointing without using his hand. Another guest laughed softly and offered what sounded like a compliment. He said the mother had a remarkable way of adapting. The word spoken like a trick, as if she were an animal trained to behave in expensive rooms. Then he added, lightly, that he'd heard she once worked in a textile factory, that she'd been one of those girls who thought hard work made up for lack of refinement. The lie landed on the table like spilled wine, quick, spreading, staining everything around it. The mother's fork paused in midair. It was a small hesitation, a movement so restrained most people wouldn't notice, but the maid did. The maid saw the mother's throat tighten once, saw her blink more slowly as if buying time. The mother's gaze shifted down toward her plate, not in shame exactly, but in the instinctive reflex of someone who had learned that looking directly at cruelty only gave it more power. She set her fork down with care, as if she were afraid of making noise. The boss felt something cold move through his chest. The problem wasn't simply the lie. The problem was the calculation behind it. The way the guests used the idea of poverty as a weapon, the way they treated labor like an infection. They weren't just trying to insult her. They were trying to rewrite her into a story that would make her easier to dismiss, easier to mock, easier to use. If she had been a factory girl, then she was an accident of history who should feel grateful for her seat. If she had been one of those, then her dignity was borrowed. He kept his expression steady. A sharp reaction would give the guests exactly what they wanted. They would frame it as a gangster's overreaction, proof that he didn't belong among civilized people. He wanted to correct it, to slice the lie cleanly in half, but he also understood the social trap. Their cruelty was masked as conversation. His power in their eyes was always the problem. They were waiting for him to turn the table into a battlefield. His mother's lips parted slightly, as if she might speak, then closed again. The pause was not weakness. It was a memory. The maid recognized it immediately because she had lived it too. That moment when you measure the cost of defending yourself and realize the room has already decided what it will believe. The mother had survived judgment long enough to know that sometimes the safest way to endure was to let the lie pass and keep your dignity in your body, even if you couldn't keep it in the conversation. But the maid could not keep her own silence. It rose in her chest like heat, not dramatic, not reckless, just certain. She had heard the staff gossip before, soft voices in corridors, little comments about the mother's past, about how she didn't come from here. She had also heard other truths, spoken with respect when no guests were listening. That the mother had been a seamstress at home, yes, but not a factory girl. That she had cared for relatives, taken jobs that bruised her hands, and still carried herself with quiet pride. The maid didn't know every detail, but she knew enough to recognize an intentional falsehood when she heard one. She stepped forward with the tray held close to her waist, her movements controlled. She didn't slam anything down. She didn't raise her voice. She simply placed a fresh glass near a guest's hand and, in the same calm breath, addressed the lie with respectful firmness. She stated that the mother had never worked in a factory, that the rumor was incorrect, and that the household records, employment papers and old documents kept by the estate, confirmed it. Her tone was even, almost apologetic in its politeness, but her meaning was clear. The lie would not stand unchallenged. The room shifted in a way no one could pretend not to feel. It wasn't loud. It was the sudden tightening of silence, the way forks paused, the way eyes lifted at once. The guests had expected obedience from staff, invisibility, neutrality. A maid correcting them was not merely surprising. It was insulting to their worldview. It suggested that truth could come from below the table, from hands that served, from a uniform they believed erased personhood. The boss turned his head slightly, not in anger, but in something rarer for him, surprise edged with respect. He was used to loyalty bought, fear enforced, obedience trained. What he saw in the maid was different. She hadn't spoken to gain favor, not in the way ambitious people did. Her words carried the weight of moral clarity, a simple insistence that dignity mattered even when the powerful wanted to play with it. Her courage wasn't theatrical. It was quiet and real, the kind that cost something. His mother lifted her eyes. For the first time that evening, her gaze met the room's cruelty without lowering. There was gratitude there, but also a flicker of pain, as if the maid's defense reminded her of how long she had been swallowing insults alone. Her lips tightened, then softened, and the boss saw a tremor of emotion she had been holding back with practiced discipline. The guest's reaction came quickly, and it was uglier than their earlier politeness. A woman scoffed, letting the sound carry just enough contempt to sting. A man laughed in disbelief, as if the maid had told a joke. Someone muttered a comment about staff forgetting their place, and another added that servants always had opinions when they should have gratitude. Their class collapsed in seconds, revealing what it had always been, entitlement dressed in etiquette. The maid remained still. Her cheeks warmed, not from shame but from the sudden heat of attention. She kept her eyes lowered, her hands steady, refusing to retreat into apology. The boss watched the guests show themselves so easily, and he felt something settle inside him. The evening had been a test, and in one quiet act, the maid had changed its terms. The room could still move forward with dinner and conversation, but the script had been disrupted. The lie had been named, the cruelty exposed, and his mother's dignity restored in a way that didn't require violence. As the conversation cautiously restarted, strained and quieter, the boss reached for his water and took a slow sip. He did not speak yet. He didn't need to. His silence now carried a different weight, and his mother's posture looked less like endurance and more like choice. The maid stepped back toward the wall, returning to her role, but she did so with her spine straighter than before. The room could pretend to recover, but something essential had shifted. Truth had entered the table, and it had come from the person they least expected. The silence after the maid's correction did not shatter. It settled. It draped itself across the table like a cloth laid down too carefully, making every movement feel heavier, every clink of cutlery sound like a decision. The chandelier still shone with the same patient brightness, the food still released the same warm scent, but the guests' faces had changed in small ways. Smiles tightened at the corners, eyes darted more often, shoulders shifted as if comfort had become risky. They were no longer performing ease. They were recovering from being interrupted. The boss did not fill the space with anger. He let the pause breathe long enough to remind everyone that he had heard everything and would not be rushed into reaction. His authority was not the loud kind that needed threats. It was the quiet kind that made other people measure their tone. He turned his gaze slowly along the table, not lingering in accusation, simply seeing. The ones who had been bold a moment ago now avoided his eyes with sudden fascination for their plates. Those who had laughed wore expressions that tried to suggest innocence, as if laughter could be mistaken for misunderstanding. He set his glass down with controlled gentleness. The sound was soft, yet it landed with purpose. When he spoke, his voice held a calm that didn't ask permission. He addressed the room with the politeness of a host and the precision of a man who understood leverage. He said, evenly, that rumors were cheap and that tonight was a gathering of adults, not a marketplace for gossip. He thanked everyone for honoring his home and reminded them, without naming anyone, that respect was not optional inside these walls. The words were measured, clean, and almost courteous, which made them sharper. He did not defend his mother in a way that begged for her acceptance. He defended the standard of the house, placing her dignity inside it like something unquestionable. The guests nodded quickly, some too eagerly, as though agreement could erase what had already been said. A few offered small apologies that were not apologies at all, phrased as regret that anyone had taken offense. The boss did not correct them publicly. He knew what they were doing, trying to shift responsibility onto sensitivity instead of cruelty. He let their words pass without granting them the dignity of debate. Debate implied the insult had been a legitimate point. He moved the conversation forward with a slight turn of his hand and a change of topic, as if to say the matter had been handled and would not be revisited at the table. That was the de-escalation. No raised voice, no slammed fist, no visible punishment. To anyone watching from outside, it might have looked like a simple social correction, a wealthy man maintaining order at his dinner. But inside the room, people felt the warning beneath the civility. They understood that the boss had chosen restraint, and that restraint was a choice he could reverse if he wanted. The maid, standing along the wall, felt her heart continue to pound even as the room pretended to return to normal. She kept her hands folded and her gaze lowered, yet she could feel the guests' contempt pressing toward her like heat. As the plates were cleared and refilled, the dinner resumed with a forced smoothness. Conversations became safer, drifting toward neutral subjects, travel, art, business achievements described in glossy terms. The laughter returned in smaller bursts, but it sounded thinner, and the boss noticed who avoided speaking now. He watched the instigators retreat into caution, watched their allies protect them with a sudden change of focus, and watched the ones who had remained silent earlier keep remaining silent, as if silence were their only honest trait. His mother's posture eased slightly. It wasn't a dramatic change, just the smallest release of tension around her shoulders, a tiny shift in how she held her chin. The correction had done something that money and intimidation could not do. It had cleaned the air around her, not entirely, but enough to breathe. Her eyes lowered once, and when she lifted them again, there was a steadiness that looked less like endurance and more like quiet pride. The boss saw it and felt something twist inside him. He had spent years building a reputation that made men tremble. Tonight, a poor maid had restored his mother's dignity with a few respectful sentences. The thought unsettled him more than the insult itself. He had always believed protection was something you enforced. In his world, safety was purchased with fear, maintained with consequences, and proven with violence when necessary. He had been taught that softness invited attack. Yet the maid's firmness had not been loud, and it had not been backed by weapons or men. It had been backed by something he could not command, moral clarity. She had spoken because it was right, not because it was useful. That kind of courage did not fit easily into the logic he lived by. He glanced toward her only once, careful not to turn her into a spectacle. Her face was controlled, but a faint flush still colored her cheeks. She looked as if she were balancing on the edge of a mistake she would not take back. The boss recognized the look. He had seen it in young men who made their first irreversible decision. The difference was that those men acted for ambition or pride. The maid had acted for dignity, someone else's dignity. That distinction made him hold his breath, not in fear, but in a kind of reluctant admiration. When the main course gave way to dessert, the guests began to loosen again, the way people do when they believe the most dangerous moment has passed. Their cruelty had simply changed shape. Now it lived in glances, in the way one woman's eyes followed the maid's hands as if searching for a tremor of inadequacy. It lived in the slight smirk a man wore when the maid passed behind him, as though her existence had been made ridiculous by her audacity. The maid felt those looks like pinpricks, but she did not bend. She kept moving, doing her work with the careful precision that the household demanded, refusing to broadcast fear. At last, the dinner ended. Chairs scraped back again, softer now, as if the guests wanted to leave without leaving a mark. The boss stood when his mother stood. He offered his arm. In the corridor outside the dining room, the air was cooler, carrying the scent of wax and stone. Guests filtered toward the salon for coffee, their voices rising in polite waves. The boss's mother paused briefly near the doorway where the maid was collecting linens. Her movement was small, almost hesitant, as if she were stepping out of the role the night had forced onto her. She did not create a scene. She simply reached toward the maid with a gentleness that felt maternal rather than theatrical. Her fingers hovering for a second before they touched the maid's wrist lightly, barely more than a brush. The gesture held gratitude without ownership. Her voice, low and calm, carried the warmth of someone who had been defended in a way that reminded her she was still human, not just a symbol. She thanked the maid without praising her as a hero, without making the moment grand. The gratitude was restrained, but it was real, and in that restraint lived a longing. The longing to be respected sincerely, not guarded like property. The maid swallowed, the muscles in her throat tightening. She murmured a reply that sounded more like breath than words, eyes still lowered out of habit. She felt shaken, not by what she had done, but by what it might cost. Houses like this had rules, and rules were often enforced hardest on the people who cleaned up after everyone else's mess. She could already imagine the housekeeper's cold stare in the morning, the whispered talk among staff, the possibility of being reassigned to worse hours, worse rooms, worse treatment. She knew all that, and yet she did not regret her choice. Regret would mean admitting the lie deserved silence. Later, when she returned to the service corridor, the noise of the dinner faded behind heavy doors. The staff area smelled of soap and damp cloth, of fatigue trapped in fabric. The maid washed her hands slowly, watching the water run over her fingers, as if she could rinse away the tremor still moving through her. Her heart finally began to settle into a steadier rhythm. She was still afraid, but her fear had a shape now, and because it had a shape, it could be carried. In another corridor, the boss walked beside his mother, his steps measured. He had preserved his authority without scandal, and the room had obeyed. Yet he felt no satisfaction. Instead, he felt the quiet sting of realization. Power could silence people, but it could not always restore dignity in the way dignity needed to be restored. Tonight, that restoration had come from the least protected person in the room. As he guided his mother toward the sitting room, he held on to that truth with an unfamiliar care, letting it sit inside him not as a weakness, but as a lesson he hadn't known he needed. When the last guest's laughter dissolved into the corridor and the estate settled back into its nighttime hush, the boss did not go to sleep. He moved through the house with the same controlled pace he used in public, but now the quiet made his thoughts louder. The carpets muted his steps. The wall sconces cast warm pools of light that looked comforting until you remembered comfort could be manufactured. And he felt the weight of the evening on his shoulders like a coat he couldn't take off. In the sitting room, his mother had retired early with a tired smile that tried to reassure him, and he had let her go without pressing. He knew that if he pushed too hard, she would retreat into that practiced calm again, the calm that protected her but also kept him out. He chose instead to investigate the way he always had, by treating feelings as evidence and gathering facts until the emotion had somewhere to stand. He summoned his trusted lieutenant first, a man who carried loyalty like muscle and saw insult as a challenge that demanded a visible answer. The lieutenant's posture was ready even in a quiet room, shoulders squared, gaze steady, as if violence were not an action but a language he spoke fluently. He described the dinner guests by name, tracing their connections as if mapping a territory. Old families with legitimate businesses, men who laundered reputations through charity, women who held influence through social circles that could open doors or lock them. As he spoke, contempt sat under every word. In his mind, humiliation was a declaration of war. The lieutenant wanted retaliation, quick and unmistakable. He spoke of consequences that would reach the offenders where it hurt most. Contracts withdrawn, shipments delayed, doors closed. He believed a harsh response would protect the boss's image, preserve fear, keep people from thinking they could use the mother as a weak point. To him, restraint looked like permission. The boss listened without interrupting, letting the lieutenant say everything he needed to say. He understood the instinct because he had built an empire around it. He also understood its limits because tonight had shown him a different kind of power, one that didn't leave bruises, one that still managed to wound. When the lieutenant finished, the boss called in the family advisor, an older figure whose strength lived in patience rather than intimidation. The advisor wore the calm of someone who had watched many empires rise and fall and knew the difference between a battle and a trap. He did not deny the insult. He did not soften it. He simply warned that retaliation would give the dinner guests what they wanted. A predictable reaction that could be framed as brutality, proof that the boss was still the same criminal they whispered about behind champagne glasses. The advisor spoke of political fallout, of alliances that looked stable until they were tested, of rivals who would use even a justified punishment to rally opinion against him. In that world, the advisor reminded him, perception could be as dangerous as reality. The boss sat between these two voices, feeling the familiar tension inside himself. The part that wanted to crush disrespect and the part that understood the consequences of being seen as uncontrolled. He stared into the low flame in the fireplace, watching it move and fold in on itself. The fire did not rush. It consumed steadily. That, he realized, was what the guests had been doing. They were not trying to win a fight at the table. They were trying to set a narrative on fire and let it spread quietly until it reached his authority. He replayed the evening with a colder mind. The forced toast, the compliments that carried poison, the deliberate exclusion disguised as etiquette, the lie about his mother's past placed carefully in conversation. Not screamed, not dramatic, just planted, like a seed meant to grow. None of it had been spontaneous. People did not coordinate contempt that smoothly unless it served a purpose. The target had not only been his mother's dignity. The target had been his control. If he exploded, he confirmed their fear and their justification. If he stayed quiet, they could claim he accepted the insult, that his power did not extend even to protecting his own blood in a respectable room. Either outcome weakened him. The realization settled into his chest with a slow heaviness. This had been calculated, not personal. They were testing how he would respond when attacked through the one person who could not strike back. His mother's past was their chosen weapon because it was both intimate and socially acceptable to mock. They could sneer at a poor upbringing while pretending they were discussing background and culture. They could reduce her into a story that made her smaller, and by making her smaller, they implied he was still the boy who came from her, still the outsider who didn't belong among their polished tables. It was not merely humiliation. It was an attempt to undermine him in a way that didn't look like conflict. He dismissed the men with a brief nod, telling them he would decide the next step. Alone again, he walked the hallway outside his mother's room and paused. Through the door he could hear the faintest movement, the soft sound of someone shifting in bed, the quiet breath of sleep that wasn't fully restful. He felt anger rise, not sharp but dense. Anger at the guests, at the game, at himself for allowing the atmosphere to reach that point before it was stopped. He also felt something else, more uncomfortable: admiration. The maid had done what he couldn't do without turning the room into a threat. She had defended his mother's dignity without giving the guests a spectacle. She had used truth like a blade and kept her voice low enough that the room had to lean in and listen. In the staff quarters on the lower floor, the maid's night looked very different. Her room was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a window that showed only a sliver of garden hedges. She washed her uniform by hand in a basin because the household laundry was always prioritized for guest linens first. The soap was cheap, the water cool. Her knuckles were raw from scrubbing, and the sting reminded her she was still in her own life, not in the glittering performance upstairs. As she worked, she thought about her family obligations the way she always did, quietly, constantly, like a second heartbeat. There were bills that arrived with no mercy, medicine that couldn't be postponed, and relatives who depended on her wages because dependence was the only stability poverty offered. She had learned to endure humiliation early. She had endured it in markets where merchants spoke to her as if she were dishonest by nature, in side streets where strangers judged her clothes, in houses where rich women gave orders without using her name. Endurance had been a skill, a form of discipline that kept her employed and kept food on the table at home. Tonight, something had cracked that discipline, not into rebellion but into refusal. The lie about the mother had been too clean, too cruel, too deliberate. It had turned suffering into entertainment. And in that moment the maid's silence had felt like collaboration. She had spoken because she couldn't carry that kind of collaboration back to her family and still look at herself. Now, in the quiet of her room, the fear arrived late. She imagined consequences. The senior housekeeper's disapproval, a demotion to harder work, a sudden termination disguised as lack of professionalism. She imagined being forced to explain to her family why the money stopped. Her throat tightened, and for a moment her hands slowed in the water. Then she took a steadying breath and continued scrubbing. The certainty remained beneath the fear. She had done the right thing. If punishment came, it would not turn the truth into a mistake. Upstairs, the boss sat at his desk, papers spread out like fragments of a larger picture. Names, connections, rumors that had circulated for years, resentments that never fully died. He saw now that the dinner was only one movement in a longer story. The people who humiliated his mother were not merely rude. They were strategic. They believed her past could be used to make him react, to make him appear unstable, to invite others to challenge him. The difference between him and them, he realized, was not simply power. It was that he understood the cost of humiliation because he had lived close to it, while they treated it as sport. By the time the estate finally fell silent, the boss had reached a calm that wasn't softness, but clarity. He would not respond in a way that gave them a scandal. He would respond in a way that revealed their intent. And somewhere in that clarity, he kept returning to the image of the maid. A young woman with worn seams in her uniform, standing in a room of polished cruelty and choosing truth anyway. He did not yet know what her courage would mean for the household, but he understood one thing with uncomfortable honesty. Tonight, the strongest defense of his mother had not come from fear. It had come from dignity. Morning arrived without ceremony, as it often did in houses where nights were built to feel endless. The estate's corridors held a pale, filtered light that slipped through tall windows and landed on the floor like diluted milk. Somewhere outside, gardeners moved quietly among hedges, trimming shapes that had been decided long before their hands ever touched the shears. Inside, the air smelled faintly of wax and linen, of a cleanliness that always implied someone else had woken earlier to make it possible. The boss had not slept much. His body had learned to survive on short rest, but his mind did not always obey the same discipline. He sat at the edge of a leather chair in the sitting room, elbows on his knees, hands clasped as if he were holding something fragile. The anger from the night before had cooled into something heavier and more complex, the way metal cools after heat. Still dangerous to touch, but no longer glowing. The dinner had been an insult, yes, but it had also been a lesson, about the kind of harm that could enter a room without leaving bruises, and about the kind of power that could not be confronted with a gun or a threat. His mother entered slowly, already dressed, hair pinned back in the simple style she favored when she didn't want to attract attention. She carried a small tray herself, not because the staff were absent, but because sometimes she refused to let other people make her feel helpless. There was coffee, dark and strong, and a small plate with bread she barely touched. She placed the tray down with steady hands. Her face was calm, but the calm was thinner than it had been the night before, like fabric worn at the seam. He stood instinctively, not out of fear, but out of respect that had grown sharper with age. For years he had insisted that everything he did was for her, that every harsh decision was a form of protection. Yet watching her now, he understood that protection could become another kind of distance. It could be a wall built so high it kept the protected person from being fully seen. She sat across from him and looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing whether he was ready to hear what she had never demanded he know. Her gaze was not accusing. It was almost maternal in the truest sense, concerned with his soul as much as his safety. Then, in a voice that stayed soft, she began speaking about her past in the same way she had always survived. Without ornament, without self-pity, choosing words that didn't beg for sympathy. She told him about the years before the estate, when the city felt larger and colder and people like them were always one missed payment away from disaster. She spoke of the kind of work that left her hands cracked, of long nights sewing and mending because buying new was never an option. She spoke of carrying him when he was small and feverish, walking to clinics where the waiting rooms smelled of disinfectant and despair, and learning to smile politely at nurses who treated the poor like inconveniences. The details came out slowly, not because she forgot them, but because she had spent so long locking them away to keep moving forward. As she spoke, he felt a strange tightening in his throat. He had heard fragments before. He had lived parts of that childhood. But hearing her say it now, plainly, made it different. It gave the memories a weight he had avoided, because acknowledging the full reality of her sacrifices would force him to confront what his empire was built on. Not only ambition, but fear. Fear of being powerless again. Fear of seeing her humiliated. Fear of watching the world treat the two of them as disposable. She admitted, with a small pause that looked like hesitation, that she had tolerated disrespect on purpose. Not because she believed she deserved it, but because she had learned how easily men like him could be provoked. She had seen what happened when anger took over, how one insult could become bloodshed, how bloodshed could become cycles that swallowed everything. She said she had chosen to absorb shame at times because it prevented death, and because she knew the cost of death better than the guests at the table ever would. In her moral code, endurance was sometimes a form of mercy. The boss leaned back slightly as if the chair had shifted under him. He realized he had always thought of her patience as vulnerability. He had never fully considered it as strategy, as restraint born of wisdom rather than submission. He had assumed he was the one who understood consequences. She was telling him she had been managing them too quietly, for years. Outside, a bird called once, clear and ordinary, and the sound felt almost inappropriate against the heaviness in the room. The boss looked down at his hands. They were steady, capable hands, hands that had signed deals and ordered punishments and held weapons without trembling. Yet now they felt clumsy, unable to grasp what mattered. He had built a life around the idea that no one would ever harm her again, and still she had been harmed in the one place his violence could not reach. In her dignity, in the way people looked at her, spoke about her, reduced her into a story that made them feel superior. "I thought I was protecting you," his expression said even before his mouth could. The guilt came in waves, not dramatic, but persistent. He remembered the guests' smiles and the way his mother's eyes had lowered for a moment before she recovered. He remembered how carefully she had swallowed pain so he wouldn't turn the table into a battlefield. He realized that his reputation, his brutality, his empire, none of it had prevented the most intimate injury. Shame moved differently than physical danger. It slipped through polite words and silk clothing and laughter, and it could land without leaving evidence. His mother watched him with a tenderness that did not excuse him, but did not condemn him either. She told him she was proud of his strength, but she was tired of being treated as a symbol, either the saintly mother who deserved reverence because she belonged to him, or the poor woman who deserved mockery because she didn't belong to their world. She wanted genuine respect, the kind that did not depend on fear or money, the kind that allowed her to exist as herself. In her voice was the quiet ache of someone who had spent years being spoken about instead of being listened to. In the pause that followed, he thought of the maid. Not as a servant, not as a useful tool, but as a person with a spine made of something he couldn't buy. The maid had stepped into a room full of wealth and cruelty and refused to let the lie stand. She had defended his mother without turning it into a performance, without trying to win favor. And that act, he realized, mirrored something in his mother. The endurance, the capacity to live under judgment without losing inner dignity. The difference was that the maid had refused to treat humiliation as normal. She had reached a point where her moral line mattered more than her fear. His mother, too, seemed to be thinking of her. She said the girl's voice had felt like sunlight in a place that had been dim for too long. Not because it solved everything, but because it reminded her that goodness could still exist in a house built on power. The mother's gratitude carried a restrained warmth, almost protective, as if she recognized in the maid a younger version of herself. Someone who worked quietly to survive, who understood what it meant to be looked down on, and who still carried enough dignity to defend another. The boss felt something shift inside him, subtle but real. He had always believed that respect came from control, from the certainty that people would fear consequences. Now he was being forced to see another form of respect, one that came from truth spoken calmly, from boundaries held without violence. It did not replace his world. It challenged it. It made him question whether his mother needed a fortress around her or a different kind of life within it. When his mother finally stood, she placed her hand briefly on his shoulder. The gesture was gentle, but it carried the weight of years. She did not ask him to change overnight. She did not demand revenge or forgiveness. She simply left him with her truth, trusting him to do something honest with it. As she walked out of the room, her steps were quiet, but she looked lighter, as if speaking had released a burden she had carried alone. He remained seated for a long time, listening to the house breathe. The morning light continued to climb the walls. Somewhere, a door closed softly. The world moved forward, and in that movement, he held onto two images with equal clarity. His mother's composed face masking pain, and a maid's steady voice correcting a lie. The chapter of the night before was over, not with violence, not with a public victory, but with a private truth that settled into him like a new kind of responsibility. The morning after the dinner, the estate looked almost embarrassed by how calm it could be. Sunlight slid through the tall windows and settled over the polished floors, turning yesterday's tension into something that could be denied if you were determined enough. The air smelled of lemon oil and hot water, the clean scent of work that never received applause. Staff moved in their usual routes, kitchen to pantry, pantry to dining room, yet their footsteps carried a new carefulness, as if the house itself had grown ears. Rumors began the way they always did. Softly, between tasks, in the narrow places where people could speak without being seen. In the laundry room, someone said the maid had forgotten her place. In the corridor outside the pantry, someone else claimed she had spoken loudly, that she had embarrassed the guests and risked the household's reputation. The words traveled faster than truth because they offered people something simple to hold. If the maid was reckless, then the discomfort of yesterday had an easy explanation. If she was seeking attention, then her courage could be reduced into vanity, and everyone else could keep believing silence was the safer virtue. By mid-morning, the story had splintered into versions that contradicted each other but shared the same purpose. Some painted her as arrogant, as if a uniform could hide ambition so well that any sign of spine must be a performance. Others insisted she had insulted the family, twisting her calm correction into disrespect. A few, quieter voices suggested she had done the right thing, but those voices were cautious, spoken in tones meant not to be overheard. In a house like this, support was dangerous if it wasn't sanctioned. The senior housekeeper became the center through which the most poisonous version flowed. She had served the estate longer than many of the younger staff had been alive, and she wore her authority like a badge polished daily. Her hair was always pinned tightly, her uniform always perfect, her gaze always scanning for mistakes the way a priest scans for sin. The maid had never been her favorite, not because the maid worked poorly, but because she worked quietly well. Quiet competence threatened people who relied on hierarchy to feel secure. The housekeeper spoke with a tight smile about discipline and protocol, reminding others that guests were sacred and staff were replaceable. She did not accuse the maid directly at first. She planted implications instead. She asked why a maid would involve herself in family matters, suggested that someone who needed attention might manufacture conflict. Her voice carried the smooth certainty of someone used to shaping narratives in the absence of power. It was not personal in the emotional sense. It was personal in the strategic one. If the maid could be labeled disruptive, the housekeeper's own control would look necessary, and her influence would tighten around the household like a well-tied knot. Upstairs, in the brighter rooms where the air smelled of expensive candles rather than detergent, an opportunistic guest lingered longer than the others. He was the type who treated social gatherings like hunting grounds, always searching for a weak point he could turn into advantage. He had laughed at the table the night before and now carried himself as though he had been wronged by the interruption. He spoke to staff with a softened voice that pretended to be friendly, asking casual questions that were not casual at all. Did the maid often cause trouble? Was the mother always so sensitive? He shaped his words into something that sounded like concern, but the intention was transparent to anyone who had ever been cornered by politeness. By the time the boss stepped into the main hall, he could feel the ripple of that gossip before anyone spoke to him. The estate had its own atmosphere, a living thing made of habit, and today that atmosphere tasted faintly metallic, like a storm building without clouds. He had already heard fragments, from the lieutenant who saw everything as an insult, from the advisor who saw everything as a trap, from staff members who reported in nervous tones because they didn't know what else to do. Each version of the story arrived dressed as loyalty and ended as manipulation. He did not summon the maid for questioning. Interrogation was too easy, too blunt, and too unfair. In his world, interrogation was what you did when you had decided someone was guilty and only needed confirmation. He did not want confirmation. He wanted truth. And truth, he had learned the hard way, did not always survive direct pressure. Instead, he chose observation. It was an older skill than violence, and for him it required more discipline. He walked through the house as if conducting routine business, letting the day unfold around him. He watched staff interactions without interrupting. He listened to how people spoke when they believed power was not nearby. He noticed who stiffened when the maid entered a room and who relaxed, who offered help and who withdrew it. Patterns revealed themselves to him the way ink revealed itself on paper once you knew where to look. The maid worked with the same careful rhythm she always had, but fear lived under her movements like a second pulse. She kept her gaze down, not out of guilt, but out of instinct. She felt eyes on her constantly, some curious, some contemptuous, some quietly sympathetic. The housekeeper's presence seemed to follow her through corridors, appearing at doorways with a look that said the maid had already been judged. The maid's hands shook once while stacking linens, then steadied again. She hated that small betrayal of her body. She hated that the rumor could reach her family through lost wages if she were dismissed. She was not a person with savings. Every coin she earned had a direction before it even reached her pocket. The thought of losing the job tightened her chest until her breaths felt shallow. Yet even with that fear, she refused to rehearse an apology. An apology would not simply be words. It would be agreement with the lie that dignity belonged only to the rich. It would mean accepting that silence was the price of survival. She had endured that price for years in other places. Last night had shown her she could not keep paying it without losing something inside herself. In the service corridor, the housekeeper finally confronted her in that controlled way that made confrontation feel like procedure. Her tone carried calm authority, the kind that suggested disobedience was childish. She reminded the maid of boundaries, of how staff were not meant to speak unless spoken to. She implied that the maid's future depended on understanding her mistake. The maid listened, shoulders square, hands folded, swallowing the urge to defend herself in the language of emotion. She did not protest loudly. She simply stated, with quiet steadiness, that she had corrected a falsehood and meant no disrespect. The simplicity of her stance was its own defiance. She would not grovel for doing what was right. From the far end of the corridor, the boss saw enough. Not the words themselves, he did not need every syllable, but the shape of the exchange. The housekeeper's tight posture, the maid's controlled stillness, the way other staff hovered at a distance pretending not to listen. He also noticed what was missing. The maid did not seek attention. She did not seek allies. She did not act like someone enjoying the spotlight. She looked like someone carrying a heavy burden and refusing to drop it simply because others demanded she do so. Later, when the opportunistic guest crossed paths with the boss near the salon, he offered a smooth remark about maintaining decorum. He framed the maid's correction as an unfortunate breach, suggesting that the household needed stronger discipline to avoid embarrassment in the future. The boss listened without reacting, letting the guest's words unfold. What he heard beneath them was hunger. The guest wanted the boss to punish the maid publicly, to restore the social order where staff were voiceless. It would reinforce the guest's worldview and give him a story to carry into other rooms. Even the Mafia boss kept his servants under control like everyone else. The boss responded with quiet neutrality, neither agreeing nor defending. He gave the guest nothing to take. But inside, something hardened into clarity. The maid had become a convenient scapegoat because scapegoats were easier than accountability. If the maid was the problem, then the guest's cruelty could remain unnamed. If the maid was out of line, then the mother's dignity could be treated as negotiable again. By the afternoon, the house settled into a tense routine. The rumors did not disappear, but they began to lose their energy in the face of the boss's steady presence. He did not announce judgments. He did not demand confessions. He simply watched, and his watching changed people's behavior. The maid continued working, fear still present, but steadied by a stubborn inner refusal to be rewritten into someone smaller. When evening came, the light outside softened and the estate's windows reflected the gardens like dark mirrors. The maid finished her tasks with tired hands and a mind that wouldn't rest. She still did not know what consequences awaited her, but she knew what she would not do. She would not apologize for protecting someone's dignity. That knowledge did not erase her fear, but it gave her fear a boundary. And in a house where everyone was trying to reshape the story, that boundary was the closest thing to peace she could claim. The boss did not summon the maid with the sharpness of authority. He arranged the meeting the way he arranged everything that mattered, quietly, with the house made to feel inevitable around it. In the late afternoon, the estate's light turned honeyed, stretching long shadows across the hallways and softening the edges of portraits that had watched generations repeat the same mistakes with different manners. A message reached the service corridor without being spoken aloud, passed through the housekeeper's stiff nod and a younger maid's nervous glance. She was needed upstairs. She washed her hands twice before going, though they were already clean. The habit was not about hygiene, it was about control. Water gave her something simple to do while her thoughts crowded in. She smoothed her uniform, checked the seams she couldn't afford to replace, and walked with careful steps that tried not to sound like fear. The corridor to the sitting room felt longer than usual, carpet swallowing her footsteps as if the house wanted to keep her anxiety private. Inside, the sitting room was warmer than the rest of the estate, lit by a low fire and the last gentleness of daylight. The air held the scent of old leather and coffee, of polished wood that had absorbed decades of whispered deals. The boss stood near the window with his hands behind his back, posture still and deliberate, looking out at the garden as if it could answer questions people couldn't. His mother sat in an armchair beside a small table, a cup untouched in front of her, her gaze steady in the way it had become since the dinner, calm, but no longer willing to disappear. The maid stopped just inside the doorway and lowered her head out of instinct. She expected reprimand. She expected silence that would feel like punishment. Instead, the boss turned and regarded her with an attention that made her feel both seen and vulnerable. He did not make her wait long, but he also did not soften his presence. When he spoke, his voice stayed even, restrained, the voice of a man who could end lives and still choose his words carefully. He said he had heard what happened. He acknowledged that she had spoken when others stayed quiet. There was no dramatic praise, no romantic gratitude. It sounded like an observation, the kind that carried weight because it came from someone who rarely admitted surprise. Then he offered her something practical. A safer role within the household, away from the daily exposure to guests and staff politics. Better pay, better hours, security that would not depend on the mood of a housekeeper or the gossip of servants. He framed it as gratitude, but not the fragile gratitude of a man trying to feel good about himself. It was the gratitude of someone who understood debts and intended to settle them. The maid's first reaction was relief so strong it almost made her knees weak. Better pay meant medicine bought on time, debts eased, meals that didn't require counting coins. Safety meant not having to flinch every time the housekeeper passed. For a few seconds her mind tried to accept the offer as salvation, to grab it like a rope thrown into deep water. She imagined going home with more money, hearing her family breathe easier. She imagined waking without dread. Then a colder thought arrived, quiet but insistent. Safety in this house often came with strings you didn't see until they tightened. Proximity to power was not neutral. It changed the air around you. It attracted attention, jealousy, expectations. She had seen how favorites were treated, lifted up for others to resent, kept close enough to be controlled, turned into symbols rather than people. And she had seen how the boss's world worked even in its quiet moments. Protection could look like possession if the protector wasn't careful. She kept her eyes lowered, searching for the right balance between honesty and survival. Refusing a gift from a man like him could be read as insult. Accepting it too quickly could become a surrender she didn't fully understand. Her throat tightened with the knowledge that she was standing between two dangers: poverty that could ruin her family, and power that could swallow her identity. The boss watched her face as if reading the movements she couldn't hide. He had interrogated hardened men who lied without blinking. Yet this young woman's silence told him more than a confession would. He could see the gratitude trying to rise and the caution holding it down. That caution irritated him at first, not because he wanted blind loyalty, but because he wasn't used to kindness being questioned. In his life, favors were accepted quickly because refusing them was rarely safe. He had spent years creating a system where people complied. Now he was trying to offer something without forcing it, and he realized how unfamiliar that was. His mother spoke then, quietly, in a tone that shifted the room. It was not the tone of someone pleading. It was the tone of someone protecting a boundary. She reminded her son that help was only help if it respected the other person's freedom. She said the maid deserved to choose what she wanted, not to be moved like an object from one corner of the house to another. The mother's words carried a restrained warmth toward the maid, almost maternal, as if she recognized something in her. Someone who worked to survive, someone who had been looked down on, someone who still held her dignity like a private flame. The maid felt her cheeks warm, not from shame, but from being defended again. She had not expected that. In most places, women like the mother were expected to accept loyalty and move on, to let the person beneath them disappear back into service. Yet the mother's attention held a human quality that did not treat the maid as a tool. The maid's fear softened at the edges, and she found enough courage to lift her gaze slightly, not fully meeting their eyes but no longer hiding completely. She answered carefully. She said she was grateful. She said the offer meant a great deal. She did not apologize for what she had done, and she did not perform defiance. She simply admitted, in a voice that stayed respectful, that she valued her work and her independence, that she had obligations outside the estate, that she could not accept a change that felt like losing herself, even if it came wrapped as protection. Her words were simple, but each one landed with intention, like stepping stones placed across a river. The boss felt a subtle heat rise behind his ribs. Not anger at her, but anger at his own instinct. His first impulse had been to solve the problem with a command. Move her, shield her, pay her, control the variables. It was the same impulse that had built his empire. He had protected his mother with walls and men, believing that if nothing could touch her physically, she would be safe. Yet she had been wounded by shame, and now he was facing another truth. People could be harmed by protection too, if protection became a cage. He turned away briefly, looking back toward the garden. The hedges were trimmed into clean lines, disciplined shapes, beautiful because they were controlled. The image felt too close to his own thinking. Control created order, but it also stripped wild things of their nature. He understood then why the offer felt like a trap to the maid. In his world, safer often meant closer. Closer meant watched. Watched meant owned in ways that could be explained politely. His mother's voice remained steady. She said there were ways to help without claiming. Better pay without expectation of gratitude performed daily. Protection that didn't require the maid to become a symbol of his generosity. A role that gave her stability without removing her choice. The mother was not naive about the dangers around them. She knew the house had enemies, knew how staff could be punished for the smallest shifts in hierarchy. But she also knew that dignity could be injured by gifts that demanded submission. The maid stood very still, feeling the room's warmth on her skin. She realized she was not only negotiating a job. She was negotiating the terms of her personhood in a place designed to reduce staff into function. She could feel her fear of poverty pressing on her back, urging her to accept anything offered. She could also feel another fear, quieter but deeper. The fear of becoming someone else's story, someone else's proof of virtue. The boss finally faced her again. His expression had not softened, but something in it had changed. less like a verdict, more like consideration. He told her the offer was not a command. He said she would not be punished for refusing it. His tone stayed controlled, but the effort behind it was real. He was learning, uncomfortably, that true security could not be forced onto another person without becoming its opposite. If he wanted to honor what she had done, he had to respect the very thing that made her act meaningful, her freedom to choose. The meeting ended without ceremony. The maid lowered her head again, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. She left the sitting room with her heart still unsettled, yet lighter in one specific way. She had not apologized for dignity, and she had not been crushed for it. Behind her, the boss remained by the window, holding a dilemma he could not solve with intimidation. How to give protection without taking autonomy. In a house built on control, that question felt like the beginning of a different kind of power, quieter and harder, and perhaps more honest than the fear he had always relied on. The estate held its afternoons in a kind of controlled quiet, as if even time had been trained to move politely. Sunlight lay across the marble in long pale bands, and the air carried a faint mixture of brewed coffee and lemon polish. Somewhere beyond the windows, a fountain kept repeating the same soft sound, steady enough to feel like reassurance. Yet beneath that calm, the household had become a place of listening. People lowered their voices when they passed certain doors. Names traveled through corridors like drafts. What had happened at the dinner had not ended with dessert. It had simply moved into the walls. The maid returned to her routine with the caution of someone walking near an edge she couldn't see. She did her work carefully, folding linens with flat palms, adjusting vases so the stems faced outward, wiping fingerprints from silver until the metal reflected her face back at her in distorted fragments. Her body was present, efficient, almost invisible, but her mind stayed restless. The boss's offer still echoed in her, not as temptation alone, but as a question about the cost of safety. Better pay meant breathing room, and breathing room meant her family might stop living in constant arithmetic. But being pulled closer to power meant becoming part of a world she had only ever watched from the margins. A world where generosity could turn into ownership without warning. Her obligations did not wait for philosophical clarity. They arrived as pressure in her chest the moment she thought of home. She had a younger sibling who still believed adults could fix things if they tried hard enough, and that belief made every unpaid bill feel like a betrayal. She had a parent whose illness had turned the family into a fragile system of borrowed time and borrowed money. The maid had learned to carry those needs without speaking them aloud, because speaking them too openly often invited pity, and pity in the wrong hands became another form of humiliation. Debt had a way of making you grateful to people who didn't deserve gratitude, and she had promised herself she would not let desperation make her smaller than she already was. When a midweek break finally came, she used it the way she always did. Not for rest, but for errands. The city outside the estate felt louder, sharper, as if it didn't bother pretending to be kind. She walked through streets where shopkeepers watched her clothes and guessed her pockets, where buses sighed at the curb with tired impatience. She bought medicine with money that left her purse too light, then stopped by a small apartment where her family lived close together in rooms that never truly warmed. The air inside smelled faintly of cooked rice and cleaning product, and her parents' breathing had a thin rasp that made the maid's stomach tighten with helplessness. Her sibling tried to talk brightly, pretending nothing was wrong, but the maid could read fear in the way the child's hands kept folding and unfolding the same napkin. The maid promised stability in simple words, told them she had work, that she was fine, that she would manage. She did not mention the dinner or the rumors or the offer from the boss. She did not want her family to look at her with new anxiety, or worse, with a kind of hope that could be crushed. When she left, she carried a small container of leftovers in one hand and the weight of responsibility in the other, returning to the estate as if she were returning to a battlefield no one admitted existed. Back at the house, the boss's inner circle reacted to the situation with the familiar split of men who had learned different lessons from the same violence. One of them, loyal and practical, spoke of the maid with reluctant admiration. He respected people who stayed steady under pressure, even if they wore uniforms. He had seen too many people fold when money or fear touched them, and the maid's refusal to apologize for dignity registered in him as something rare. Another man, sharper and more cautious, viewed her as a liability. He saw how quickly a small act could become a story, how stories could become leverage, and he believed any staff member drawing attention risked inviting enemies into the household. To him, the maid was not brave. She was unpredictable. The boss listened to both perspectives with the same expression he wore when men discussed shipments and territory. But inside, the discussion touched something more intimate. He recognized the instinct to eliminate variables. He had built his life around controlling outcomes, around making sure nothing unexpected could threaten him. And yet the maid's act had been unexpected in the best way. It had defended his mother without blood, without scandal, and it had forced him to confront the limits of intimidation. His men saw the maid as either useful or dangerous. He could not help seeing her also as human, and that complicated everything. The mother, meanwhile, did not treat the maid as a symbol in the household's arguments. She began, quietly, to seek her out in small, ordinary moments, the way lonely people reach for connection without wanting to admit they need it. It started with tea in the late morning, when the house was calm and the rooms felt too large. The mother would ask for a cup and then ask the maid to sit for a moment, not as a command but as an invitation disguised as routine. The maid would hesitate at first, trained to believe her presence was always an intrusion, but the mother's attention did not carry the sharpness of hierarchy. It carried softness and a kind of careful respect. They spoke in gentle fragments. The mother asked simple questions about the maid's day, about whether she ate enough, whether the staff treated her fairly. The maid answered cautiously at first, aware that honesty could be dangerous, but the mother did not push. She listened the way people listen when they are not collecting information to use later. In return, the maid began to notice things about the mother that the dinner guests had never cared to see. How she moved through the house with the practiced silence of someone who didn't want to take up space. How she sometimes stood by a window for too long as if the view was the only place she could breathe freely. The mother's wealth surrounded her, yet loneliness clung to her like a shawl she couldn't remove. Sometimes the bond formed through chores rather than conversation. The mother insisted on helping arrange flowers, choosing stems with a careful eye, hands moving slowly as if the task soothed her. The maid, standing beside her, realized the mother's hands were not the pampered hands the guests imagined. They were hands that had known work, hands that held a memory of struggle even now, beneath the jewelry and fine fabric. In those moments, class felt less like a wall and more like a shadow cast by circumstance. They were two women shaped by judgment in different ways, finding something honest in the quiet. The estate became an emotional crossroads where every interaction carried double meaning. Staff watched the mother's attention toward the maid with curiosity and resentment, whispering about favoritism even when none had been declared. The housekeeper tightened her control, correcting small errors more harshly, as if discipline could erase the instability of kindness. The boss's men watched from the edges, unsure whether the maid represented a new vulnerability or a new standard. And the maid herself moved through it all, trying to protect her family with wages while protecting her dignity with silence when necessary and truth when she could not bear silence anymore. One evening, as the sun fell and the lamps were turned on one by one, the maid carried a tray past the sitting room and heard the boss speaking quietly to his mother. Not arguing, not plotting, simply speaking in that controlled tone that suggested he was trying to understand something he could not command. The maid did not stop. She did not listen. She kept walking because she had learned that overheard truths could become dangerous. Yet the sound of that restrained conversation stayed with her as she returned to the service corridor. It suggested the house was changing in slow, uncertain ways. By night, when the halls dimmed and the staff finished their final tasks, the maid sat on the edge of her narrow bed and counted her money twice, then folded it into the same small envelope she used for her family. Her fear had not disappeared. Security still felt fragile, and the offer of a safer role still hovered like a door half open. But something else had grown alongside the fear, the recognition that tenderness could exist even here, in a place built on power, and that tenderness did not have to erase her autonomy. The day ended without resolution, but it ended with something steady. The maid knew why she worked, who she worked for at home, and what she would not trade away, even for safety. The boss chose a morning when the city was still half asleep to begin undoing what the dinner had tried to build. In the estate, curtains were drawn back with quiet hands, and light entered the rooms like a guest that didn't ask permission. The house smelled of coffee and polished wood, but the boss's attention was elsewhere, fixed on the invisible web that connected names, companies, favors, and the kind of reputations that survived only because no one forced them into daylight. He did not call for weapons. He did not demand a list of people to scare. Instead, he asked for files. Not the romantic kind of file, not the one whispered about in movies, but the ordinary kind. Invoices, contracts, shipping schedules, legal documents, emails printed and annotated. The men around him reacted with a faint stiffness, the way men react when the language they understand is replaced with another they don't fully trust. A few had expected the boss to correct humiliation the way he always corrected threats. Fast, unmistakable, brutal enough that rumors would carry the message farther than bullets ever could. But he sat at his desk with a pen in his hand and asked for proof. His lieutenant stood nearby, arms crossed, impatience barely contained. In that man's mind, humiliation demanded retaliation, because retaliation kept people afraid to try again. He watched the boss read and mark pages, and something in him tightened, like a dog trained to bite being asked to wait. The family advisor, on the other hand, looked almost relieved. His posture remained calm, his face showing nothing but attentiveness, yet the room seemed to breathe easier with him present, as if restraint had finally been granted legitimacy. The boss moved through the information the way he moved through hostile rooms. Quietly, without rushing, catching patterns others missed. He traced the dinner guests' networks, their investments, their partnerships, the charities that cleaned their names, the suppliers that kept their businesses alive. He did not need to invent consequences. The world already offered them. People like those guests believed they were untouchable because they had money and social standing, because they could humiliate without being challenged. The boss understood a different truth. Money depended on systems, and systems always had weak points. By late afternoon, calls began. Polite calls that sounded like routine adjustments. Contract was delayed. A partnership meeting was postponed indefinitely. A shipment that someone relied on did not arrive on schedule. Nothing that could be called an attack. Nothing that could be turned into a public complaint without exposing private arrangements they preferred to keep quiet. The boss did not announce these consequences in a dramatic way. He allowed them to unfold like weather, impartial and unavoidable. It was accountability disguised as ordinary business. His men remained unsettled. One of them muttered that this was too soft, that people would interpret it as weakness. Another argued quietly that quiet pressure could be more frightening than a public beating, because it made enemies doubt their own stability. The lieutenant's gaze sharpened, as if searching for the moment when the boss would finally give in to the old language. But the boss did not. He kept his voice even, his orders precise. Fear was easy. Discipline was harder. He chose the harder path. The maid observed these shifts from the edges, because edge positions were where staff lived. She carried trays past offices, heard fragments of phone calls, saw the way the boss's men entered rooms with tense shoulders and left them with reluctant silence. She did not know the details of the documents, but she recognized the shape of what was happening. There were no raised voices in the corridors, no slammed doors, no sudden disappearance of a guest rumored to be handled. Instead, there was a steady tightening of control, a kind of pressure that didn't require spectacle. It changed the way she saw the boss. She had grown up believing men like him were only dangerous because they were violent. The dinner had shown her his restraint, but this was different. This was not restraint born of politeness. This was restraint born of calculation and principle, a refusal to let cruelty set the terms of his response. She understood, in a quiet way, that his strength was not only in making others fear him. It was in making himself wait, in choosing a consequence that would expose the offenders without turning the house into a theater of brutality. The mother felt the change too, though she did not speak of it directly. The days after the dinner had been heavy with whispers and subtle shifts in how staff and visitors looked at her. Some had treated her with more caution, as if the maid's defense had made her suddenly dangerous by association. Others had continued to view her as an outsider who had borrowed a seat at the table. But now, as the boss's strategy unfolded, something in the social air began to adjust. It wasn't admiration. It was a forced recognition. The truth about the dinner, about who had spread lies, who had performed cruelty under the mask of etiquette, started to circulate through the same channels that had once protected those guests. A few social invitations quietly disappeared from certain calendars. A few phone calls were not returned. A few well-placed people began acting as if they had never enjoyed the guest's company in the first place. Cruelty, when it was exposed, lost its elegance. The mother regained a measure of public respect not because her son had punished anyone in a visible way, but because the lie had been made inconvenient to repeat. People who cared about reputation began distancing themselves from those who had been caught using humiliation as entertainment. In the afternoons, the mother continued her small rituals. Tea poured slowly, flowers arranged with patient hands. The maid sometimes assisted, and in those moments the house felt less like a fortress and more like a home trying to remember what warmth was. The mother's posture grew subtly steadier, not because she believed the world had changed, but because she felt less alone inside it. She did not need bloodshed to feel defended. She needed truth to be acknowledged without being turned into spectacle. The boss's lieutenant confronted him privately with the blunt frustration of someone who believed fear was the only stable currency. He asked why the boss was taking the long way, why he wasn't making an example that would end gossip immediately. The boss listened, then answered with a calm that carried finality. His authority did not waver, but his reasoning was clear. Public brutality would confirm the narrative his enemies wanted, and it would make his mother's humiliation into a justification for violence. He refused to let her dignity become an excuse for more ugliness. He wanted the offenders to feel the consequences in the places they pretended were clean: business, reputation, access, so that the punishment matched the crime. The maid, hearing nothing of that conversation directly, still felt its outcome in the house's atmosphere. The staff grew less bold with their whispers. The housekeeper's cold certainty softened into cautious silence, as if she had realized the boss's attention was not easily manipulated. The opportunistic guest stopped lingering. The estate returned to its controlled quiet, but the quiet now felt less like denial and more like order restored through discipline rather than intimidation. That night, the boss stood by a window and watched the garden fountain glint under the lights. He had chosen accountability instead of revenge, and the world had not collapsed. His men were still learning what that meant, but his mother had regained something that mattered more than fear: the right to be treated as real. In the service corridor, the maid finished her work with tired hands and a steadier heart. She understood that power did not always have to be loud to be decisive, and that dignity, once defended with truth, could begin to settle back into a place it had been pushed out of. The estate grew quieter once the outside world had been handled. The phones rang less, unfamiliar names stopped appearing at the gate, and the air in the corridors lost that metallic tension that follows public conflict. But the calm did not feel like victory. It felt like the moment after a storm, when you finally notice what the water has done to the foundations. The boss walked the hallways with a steadiness that had always been mistaken for confidence, yet now it carried something closer to discomfort. He had neutralized the people who tried to humiliate his mother, but he could not pretend that humiliation had only come from them. It had also come from the way everyone, including him, had learned to treat her like a symbol instead of a person. His mother spent her mornings in the sunroom again, where light filtered through tall glass and softened the sharp lines of the house. She arranged flowers with slow hands, pausing to breathe in their scent as if it reminded her what gentleness felt like. Her dignity had returned to public view, but privately she still moved like someone who expected the floor to tilt. The maid often passed through with linens or a tray, and in those quiet crossings the mother's gaze would lift. Not demanding, not expecting service beyond duty, simply acknowledging another human being in the room. It was a small form of repair the house had not known how to offer before. The boss chose a late afternoon to speak with his mother without witnesses. No lieutenant waiting in the corner, no advisor hovering by the door, no staff passing through with silent ears. Only the two of them and the slow ticking of a clock that made time feel honest. He did not begin with excuses. He did not say he had done what he could. He sat across from her and let the silence stretch until it stopped being a tool and became an opening. Then he acknowledged the truth in plain words. He had seen what was happening at the dinner, and he had waited too long to stop it. Not because he didn't care, but because he was calculating, and because calculation had become his first language. His mother's expression did not change dramatically. She did not reward him with immediate forgiveness or punish him with anger. She simply listened, eyes steady, the way she had listened through years of his life when he spoke about power as if it were protection. And when he finished, she said something that did not accuse but also did not soften the reality. She had learned to endure shame so that he would not spill blood. She had done it out of love, yes, but also out of principle. She refused to be the reason someone else's son didn't come home. Her morality had always been quieter than his, and it had cost her more than he wanted to admit. The guilt that rose in him was not the kind that demanded theatrical self-hatred. It was the kind that makes you see your own patterns clearly and realize they have harmed the person you meant to protect. He had built an empire to keep threats away from her body, and yet he had allowed threats to touch her dignity because he believed he could manage the fallout later. He had treated her as a pillar of his image, proof of loyalty, proof of family, proof of roots, without asking what it cost her to be carried around like evidence. The shame she endured was not only from the guests. It was from living inside his world where her pain was always secondary to strategy. He tried to repair it the only way he knew at first, offering to change procedures, to limit visitors, to remove staff who didn't respect her, to tighten the estate like a fist around her comfort. His mother shook her head gently. She didn't want to be hidden. She didn't want to be protected like a fragile object. She wanted to be seen as a person whose dignity did not depend on fear. Her voice carried an old tiredness when she said she had lived too long under other people's decisions. Poverty deciding for her, power deciding for her, society deciding who she was allowed to be. She wanted, at least inside her own home, to be treated as herself. That truth changed the shape of the conversation. The boss found himself speaking less and listening more, which was harder than any threat he had ever made. He asked what she needed, and the question sounded strange in his mouth because he had always assumed he knew. She told him she needed him to notice sooner, to correct cruelty without turning it into spectacle, and to stop using her as a quiet justification for his violence. She did not deny that he had protected her in many ways. She simply insisted that protection without emotional awareness could still become a form of abandonment. His silence after that was not resistance. It was the slow acceptance of a truth he could not bargain with. While the family turned inward, the maid felt the household's attention shifting again, and it made her uneasy. Some staff had begun treating her with a forced respect that felt like distance. Others treated her with resentment that hid behind politeness, as if her integrity had made their own silence look ugly. The housekeeper, still stiff and watchful, adjusted her tone toward the maid with reluctant caution, like someone who had realized the boss was paying attention. Even kindness from others felt dangerous now, because it carried the possibility of being turned into a story. The brave maid, the loyal girl, the symbol of the boss's generosity. Symbols were never safe. The boss called the maid in again, but this time he did not speak as if he were settling a debt. His tone was controlled, yet there was something different in the way he held the space, as if he was trying not to dominate it. He spoke of boundaries, of respect, of how the household should function moving forward. He offered practical improvements again, pay, stability, protection from petty punishment, but he did it with a clearer intent. Not to claim her, not to display her, but to remove the vulnerability that made her family's survival dependent on the moods of others. The maid felt the old fear rise anyway. She had learned that offers from powerful people could turn into chains, and she was not naive enough to believe good intentions erased that risk. She answered with careful firmness. She said she would not be treated as a hero. She would not be brought into rooms as an example of his benevolence, praised publicly while still expected to accept disrespect privately. She would do her job with dignity, and she would accept fair compensation, but she would not be paraded or used to prove that the house was good. Her words were not rebellious. They were boundaries spoken in a calm voice, the kind of boundary that forces powerful people to decide whether they truly respect you or only like the feeling you give them. The boss listened, and something in him tightened, not with anger, but with the effort of changing. A part of him wanted to respond the old way, to reassure her with control, to promise she would be safe because he said so. Another part of him, the part his mother was awakening, understood that safety built on ownership was not safety. It was captivity with softer furniture. He told the maid she would not be displayed. He told her she could refuse tasks that crossed her dignity. He did not say it as a sentimental pledge. He said it as a rule that would be enforced like any other rule in the estate. His mother became the bridge between them in the days that followed, not by delivering speeches, but through small acts that translated intention into daily life. She corrected the housekeeper's tone when it sharpened into unnecessary cruelty. She thanked staff by name, quietly, without making it a performance. She spent time with the maid in ordinary moments. Tea poured, cloth folded, flowers trimmed, showing that respect could exist without spectacle. In those moments, the maid felt the strange relief of being treated as human rather than useful. By the end of the week, the estate felt altered in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. The external threat had been neutralized, yes, but the deeper repair was still in progress. The boss had begun to see his mother not as a symbol of his empire but as a woman who had endured too much for his sake. The maid had insisted on boundaries that refused both humiliation and hollow praise. And the mother, steady and quietly wise, guided the household toward something less glamorous than power and more difficult than fear. A form of respect that had to be practiced daily, in small choices, when no one was watching. The estate did not change in a single dramatic gesture. It changed the way a household changes when it has been forced to look at itself. Slowly, through repeated decisions that become habits, through silences that stop being weapons and start becoming space. Morning light still entered the corridors in pale sheets. The same polished floors still reflected the high windows, and the fountain outside still rehearsed its steady music. But now there was a different awareness in the air, as if everyone had learned that dignity was not an ornament reserved for guests. It was part of the structure, and it could not be removed without weakening the whole. Staff dynamics adjusted first, not because anyone had suddenly become kinder, but because the rules had shifted. The housekeeper still walked with her spine stiff and her gaze sharp, but she measured her sharpness now. Petty punishments stopped appearing as casually. Whispered commentary didn't vanish, yet it lost its confidence. It no longer sounded like entertainment, more like uncertainty about what would be tolerated. The younger staff began speaking the maid's name with more care, not because they admired her like a legend, but because they had seen how quickly a person could be crushed or protected, depending on whose attention found them. Respect became deliberate, practiced like a language that had to be learned rather than assumed. The mother's presence in the house became less performative and more real. She no longer moved through rooms like she was borrowing them. She took her time with her tea, not rushing to avoid anyone's gaze. She corrected small misunderstandings without apologizing for existing. When visitors appeared, fewer now and more carefully chosen, she greeted them with a calm that did not beg approval and did not hide her history behind forced elegance. The pearls remained, the quiet refinement remained, but they no longer felt like armor. They felt like preference. For the first time in a long time, she looked like a woman living in her own home, not a figure positioned inside someone else's story. The boss watched those changes with the kind of attention he once reserved for threats. He had always believed order came from fear, that peace was something you enforced with consequences. Yet he could feel the household settling into a steadier rhythm without the crackle of violence. It unsettled him at first, not because he missed brutality, but because it challenged the logic that had shaped him. His mother's dignity was no longer being defended as a symbol of his status. It was being honored as a basic truth, and that required something from him that violence never demanded: humility. He met with the maid again, not in the sitting room where power hung heavy in the furniture, but in a quieter space near the sunroom where light softened the air. He did not call her in like a subordinate brought to receive judgment. He asked her to come when she could, a small difference in wording that mattered more than it seemed. When she arrived, her posture was careful, but not shrinking. She had learned, through fear and endurance, that she could hold her boundaries without raising her voice. The boss understood now that her steadiness was not a challenge to him. It was a standard. He clarified her role in the household with precision, like a man used to defining terms so they could not be twisted. Her pay would increase, not as a reward to be pointed at, but as a correction to what her labor had always been worth. Her schedule would be protected from retaliation and petty manipulation. She would not be used as a public example of his generosity, and she would not be pulled into rooms to perform gratitude. He did not ask for loyalty beyond her work. He did not frame her protection as ownership. The words were plain, but the effort behind them was enormous. In his world, men offered security as a leash. He was learning to offer it as a floor. The maid listened without interrupting, her hands folded loosely at her waist. Relief came in slow waves rather than a sudden rush. Better pay meant her family could breathe. Protected hours meant she could visit home without begging for permission. Stability meant she could plan beyond the next bill. Yet she watched his face carefully, searching for hidden expectations, for the subtle trap of obligation. When she found none, she felt something unfamiliar in her chest. Cautious trust. Not blind trust. Not the kind that erased reality. The kind that allowed her to accept help without losing herself. Her identity remained grounded, because she refused to let the household rewrite her. She still took the bus on her day off, still bought medicine with careful counting, still returned to an apartment where the air was warm with the smell of simple food and the quiet worry of illness. She did not suddenly become a different person because money came more steadily. She simply became less afraid of the next knock at the door. Her siblings' eyes looked brighter. Her parents' breathing eased with consistent treatment. In those small improvements, she felt the dignity she had defended at the dinner returning to her own life, not as pride, but as relief. The mother, watching from her place in the house, did not treat the maid as a savior. She treated her as someone worthy of gentleness. Their bond deepened through ordinary things. Tea poured with care, flowers trimmed, quiet conversation that did not search for drama. The mother spoke less about the past now, not because it had vanished, but because it no longer needed to be defended in every room. She could mention her origins without flinching. She could laugh softly at a memory without fearing someone would use it against her. The maid listened, recognizing the shared shape of survival, the way shame tried to attach itself to poverty, the way endurance could become habit. The difference was that here, in this house, endurance was finally being met with respect. The boss's men noticed the shift and had to adapt. Some remained suspicious of softness, mistaking restraint for weakness. Others understood, slowly, that discipline could be its own intimidation. The household ran more smoothly not because fear disappeared, but because fear was no longer the main tool. People worked better when they did not feel constantly threatened. They spoke more honestly when they believed truth would not be punished. Even the housekeeper, rigid as ever, began to redirect her need for control into efficiency rather than cruelty, because she sensed that the old games had lost their protection. In the evenings, the boss sometimes walked the gardens alone. The hedges were still trimmed, the fountain still murmured, the estate still looked like power. But inside him something had shifted. He had answered humiliation without spectacle. He had exposed cruelty without blood. He had protected his mother not by making the world fear him, but by making the world face the truth. And he had given a poor maid safety without demanding her spirit in exchange. That was not a victory he could display in the streets. It was a quieter one, measured in the way his mother slept more peacefully, and the way the maid held her head a little higher without becoming arrogant. The night the household finally felt settled, the mother sat in the sunroom after dinner, the lamps casting warm circles of light, and the maid brought her tea. The gesture was simple, ordinary. The mother thanked her by name. The maid nodded and returned to her tasks without ceremony. The boss watched from the doorway, unseen for a moment, and understood that this was the ending he had been chasing without knowing it. Not dominance, not revenge, not applause. A house where dignity could survive. A house where power could exist without humiliating the powerless. The humiliation had been answered the way it should be answered, with truth, restraint, and the quiet courage of someone who refused to stay silent, and of others who finally chose to listen.